So I'm here with Christopher Perling, the Regius Professor of Greek at Oxford. As you can tell, he's a Regius Professor because of all the books in the room. Chris, introduce yourself. What do you do? How did you get into classics?
Well, as you say, I'm a Professor of Greek here in Oxford. I've been doing that for 6.5 years. Before that, I was already in Oxford. I was a tutor at University College for 29 years before that. Those two jobs aren't totally dissimilar. It means now that in my present role I do a lot more with graduate students, but I still do a certain amount of undergraduate teaching as well. Before that, well, that's going back a very long way, as people can see. It's going back to the 60s when I was at school, and I originally got interested in classics I suppose because I wanted to be a lawyer. I wanted to be rich. Somebody told me that Latin was a good thing to do, so I started putting my back into Latin, and as many people find, I think, once they start doing classics for whatever reason, it gets them. You get really interested in this. It's a subject which I found particularly fascinating because I've always been interested both in literature and history and on working on the intersection of the two. And being able to study a culture, lots of aspects of a culture, not just its language or literature, but its cultural, well, its background, its political history, its social circumstances, its thought, its archaeology. It is a subject which, as we often say, allows you to bring all these things together, and that's turned out to be true for me.
When you started to do research in Oxford, what was your particular area?
I started work then on Plutarch. It was a commentary on Plutarch's Life of Caesar, which actually I'm still working on now. I'm about to publish after not working on it continuously for all those years. I hasten to
There have been other things.
There have been other things I've done.
Why Plutarch? Who is Plutarch?
Plutarch, a biographer, moralist, rather wide-ranging author, writing about 100 AD, a little bit after most of his works, and particularly interesting to me because of the biographies. He was a very prolific writer of biographies, particularly parallel lives. We have about 48 of his biographies.
What's he doing when you say with these parallel lives? He has a Greek figure and a Roman figure alongside each other. What's he doing that for?
Partly to enable the distinguishing feature of each to come out more clearly. There's a passage in one of the moral essays where he says this explicitly: you won't find the same sort of virtue as with, I can't remember what examples he takes, but of an Achilles as of a Hector, say. But by putting two figures who both have a lot of virtues and are similar in many ways close together, you can then concentrate more illuminatingly on the ways in which they differ. And I think that's right. Using one as foil for another is an important way. I think there's probably a qualified sense at least, in which a whole series of parallel lives builds up a picture of Greece as a whole and Rome as a whole, and again the virtues of the two countries, the two civilizations, are used to bring out interesting points about each other. Roman militarism, for instance, is a recurrent theme. Greek factionalism, the way in which Greek cities often spent all their energies on fighting one another, that's a recurrent theme as well.
What's your favourite Plutarchian life, do you think, and why?
Oh, Life of Antony, which in fact I published a commentary on 20 years ago. I still think is an absolutely marvellous life. It's very much, a lot of the story is familiar, partly because of Shakespeare's play, which is very closely based on the Life of Antony. But a lot of those marvellous scenes in the play, particularly the death scene of Cleopatra, also the description of Cleopatra arriving in a barge and to spellbind everybody that sees her. All this is based extraordinarily closely on Plutarch, and one can see why Shakespeare chose it. It's just a marvellously rich, full narrative, beautifully told, and very movingly told, actually. Very few ancient writers managed that sort of moving narrative as well as Plutarch, I think.
And why do you think that Plutarchian studies have become so popular in the past couple of decades? Apart from just the fact that you're now working on it.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Alton. Well, that's of course very important. I think partly that general tendency to take ancient narrative a lot more seriously, to try to see more sympathetically what ancient writers about the past, ancient writers of historical narratives are doing, not regarding them simply as irresponsible idiots if they don't have quite the same concerns as modern historians do, seeing that there really are good reasons why they may present matters in a different order, with a different emphasis, or interested in really different things from what a modern writer of the narrative or of life of Anthony now would be doing.
Can you give us an example?
Well, I suppose the moral interest is one aspect of that, and actually moralism itself is something that requires a certain amount of analysis. We tended, I think, to regard moralism until 20, 30 years ago as something really rather crude, rather preachy. Don't behave like this, behave like that, which immediately you start applying it in those sort of terms to life like Plutarch's Antony, doesn't get you very far. Avoid Cleopatras, they can be dangerous, maybe true, but it's not terribly profound. But a lot of the moral interest is a good deal more profound than that, to actually analyse what it is in human nature, whereby people with great abilities can nonetheless have flaws that often go very closely with those. It's not just the tragic flaws, it's often the same characteristics that build people up and then destroy them.
And do you have an example of that?
Oh, well, in that particular case, again, we were just talking about that one life, Antony has a tremendous social charm in some ways. He gets on terribly well with his own troops, this builds him up as a great general, an inspiring, charismatic leader, but the same almost simplicity, bluffness, readiness to exchange jokes, camaraderie, starts being extremely destructive when it starts being shared with Cleopatra rather than with the troops.
And perhaps a final question, and one of the most difficult, and that always my parents ask me, why do you do what you do? What purpose do you think classics has in the modern world?
Well, partly it's intellectual excitement, of course, but it's a great training, and it's a great training for anything else. There is this story of, I think it was an executive of one of the great international oil companies who said, "Well, why do you employ so many classicists, for heaven's sake?" To which the answer was, "Well, we find they sell more oil." In fact, I think it is, I don't want to say it provides a better intellectual training than anything else, of course. All sorts of arts and sciences can provide a terrifically good intellectual training. But one of the great laws that one would say to any 16, 17, 18-year-old of wondering what to study at university is study what you're most interested in, as that's the best way to succeed, perhaps the only way to succeed. And enough people out there, an increasing number of people out there actually, are really interested in this. And if they are interested in this, there's certainly all sorts of intellectually exciting questions that they can wrestle with, and it's not going to provide them with a worse background for the rest of their lives than anything else.
Many thanks, Chris, for sharing your thoughts and your time and giving us an insight into various aspects of the classical world, what got you interested in it, and why people are still working with it today.
Thank you for involving me in your project.